Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. Jericho was a city as ancient as it was awe-inspiring. Its inhabitants saw themselves as invincible, protected by colossal walls, surrounded by wealth, luxury, and endless pleasures. But behind all that opulence lay a world ruled by idolatry, corruption, and moral decay. Inside its temples, pagan rituals with sexual connotations were performed shamelessly. Men and women gave themselves over to sin, believing that nothing, not even a god, could bring down that fortress. Until, in a surprising and inexplicable way, everything collapsed. What was really happening behind Jericho's walls? Why was such a prosperous city, carved into the desert, wiped from history? And could this episode serve as a warning for our times? Stay until the end, because what you'll discover about Jericho might change the way you see the world. Jericho is shrouded in mystery. Its origins trace back to the dawn of civilization. Surrounded by monumental walls, it was one of the first major urban centers on Earth, rich, powerful, and deeply immersed in idolatry and depravity. Now imagine this. You're inside the city walls, surrounded by luxury, security, and excess. Would you believe that any army could possibly breach those barriers? The people of Jericho were so confident in their fortress that they never imagined what was coming. The Bible records in Joshua 6:1-2, "Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its mighty men of valor.'" It sounds impossible, doesn't it? How could such a fortified city with towering and nearly impenetrable walls fall in just a day? But more importantly, what made God decide to destroy it? Jericho wasn't just an ordinary city, it was a symbol. Its way of life represented everything that drew humanity away from God. And here is something you need to understand. God is patient, but He does not ignore sin. What happened inside those walls went far beyond luxury and trade. Idolatry ruled the city. The people worshipped false gods, sacrificed children, and performed dark rituals. Corruption was embedded at every level. Immorality was so rampant that the people no longer recognized evil. But before we explore the spiritual downfall of Jericho and the conduct of its women, we must first understand the scale of this city. What if I told you that, before Rome, before Pharaoh's Egypt, before even Babylon, there already existed a prosperous, established, and vibrant city, a place where humanity stopped wandering and began to build something lasting? That city was Jericho. The story of Jericho goes back more than 10,000 years to a region scholars call the Fertile Crescent, a blessed land where the first humans learned to plant, to harvest, and for the first time, to settle down. While other tribes still wandered in search of food, the people of Jericho learned how to tame the land. Jericho had something no other region possessed, a freshwater spring in the heart of the desert. And where there is water, there is life. This gift of nature turned Jericho into a strategic refuge for merchants, shepherds, and travelers crossing the Jordan Valley. The book of Deuteronomy 34:3 calls Jericho the city of palms, and rightly so. Thanks to its privileged location, Jericho thrived with plantations of dates, wheat, and barley. But it wasn't agriculture alone that made Jericho stand out. The people of this ancient city were true pioneers in the art of construction. Archaeological discoveries reveal that they built stone walls at the dawn of civilization, something unheard of for that time. They knew they had to protect their city, not just from enemies, but from the desert itself. Jericho was not just an agricultural hub. It was a vibrant commercial center. Its strategic location enabled the exchange of goods across multiple regions. Salt, spices, fine fabrics, and precious metals passed through its gates, enriching its citizens even more. But there's something that the history of humanity reminds us time and again. When man prospers, he risks forgetting God. And that's exactly what began to happen in Jericho. The city, which had once been a miracle of civilization, began to turn away from its creator. What was once a center of blessing became a stage for excess, idolatry, and corruption. But how did this happen? How could a city so blessed become a symbol of spiritual decay? Before we speak of the immoral conduct of Jericho's men and women, it's important to understand the luxurious world that hid behind its walls. Jericho wasn't just an ancient city, it was a symbol of prosperity and extravagance. Those who entered its gates found bustling streets, markets full of valuable goods, and luxurious homes adorned with tapestries, gold, and precious stones. Merchants came from distant lands to trade in spices, exotic fabrics, and rare jewels. But behind all that glitter, there was a dark side few dared to confront. Jericho was wealthy, and where wealth exists without the fear of God, corruption follows. Its leaders lived surrounded by luxury, enjoying the fruits of commerce, often at the expense of the people. Money flowed abundantly, and with it came indulgence. Biblical and historical accounts describe Jericho as a city given over to idolatry. Foreign gods were worshipped, temples were built for dark rituals, including human sacrifices and sacred prostitution ceremonies. The true God had been abandoned, replaced by images, false beliefs, and deceptive promises of fertility, abundant harvests, and pleasure without consequence. To the people of Jericho, nothing seemed wrong. Their towering walls gave them a sense of invincibility. Their gods, so they believed, brought them prosperity. But what they didn't realize was that with every act of corruption, with every idolatrous rite, with every immoral practice, they were drifting further and further from the truth. Jericho became the perfect portrait of what happens when man puts his trust in wealth and power and forgets the eternal principles of God. And history shows us that this same mistake has been repeated by many civilizations across the centuries. Rome, in its golden age, was the most powerful empire in the world, but it fell into ruin after plunging into moral and spiritual decay. Sodom and Gomorrah were prosperous cities, but were destroyed because of their corruption. Jericho was heading down that same path. Its fall was not just a historical event, it was a warning to every future generation. And what's most striking is realizing that the same mindset still dominates our world today. The unrestrained pursuit of pleasure, the trust in wealth, the disregard for spiritual values. These same behaviors continue to drag individuals and entire nations into collapse. Now tell me, have you noticed how history always seems to repeat itself? How, despite countless warnings from the past, humanity keeps stumbling over the same mistakes? Leave a comment and share your thoughts on this. But there is still something that must be revealed. Inside the walls of Jericho, a darkness reigned, especially in how women were viewed and treated. In the next chapter, we will explore the shocking accounts of sexual practices and the immorality that defined that society. What happened within Jericho was far darker than many imagine. But first, we must understand what made Jericho so feared: its fortress. Jericho was not just a wealthy and influential city, it was considered impenetrable. Imagine walls so tall and imposing they seemed to touch the sky. These structures guaranteed the city's safety, making any attempt at invasion nearly impossible. Archaeological studies reveal that Jericho was protected by two layers of fortifications. The first was an outer wall of solid stone, approximately 5 meters high. On top of it stood a second wall made of mud bricks, rising another 7 meters, totaling nearly 12 meters in height. The walls were so wide that soldiers could easily patrol along the top. Moreover, Jericho was built on a natural elevation, which made attacks even more difficult. Reinforced gates, watchtowers, and complex defensive systems made the city a true stronghold. For any army of that era, attacking Jericho was a suicidal mission. And beyond its colossal walls, Jericho had something rare among ancient fortified cities: a freshwater spring within its walls. This made the city even more resilient. Even under siege, its inhabitants could survive for months, even years, without suffering from water shortage. Storehouses were full of grain and provisions, ensuring total autonomy against any external threat. This solid infrastructure and abundance of resources gave rise to a dangerous sentiment in Jericho, the illusion of invincibility. So when the Israelites arrived to conquer the Promised Land, the people of Jericho were not shaken. They believed that no force could bring down their walls. They trusted in their military strength, their physical defenses, and their own might. But they forgot the most important truth. No wall, no matter how high or thick, can stand when God decides to act. The Bible shows us that Jericho did not fall by human strength or sophisticated weapons. It fell by faith, obedience, and divine power. For 7 days, the Israelites marched around the city, exactly as God had commanded. And on the 7th day, at the sound of the trumpets and the people's shout, the walls simply collapsed. But how was that possible? Some scholars suggest that Jericho's walls were built on a geologically unstable base, which may have made them vulnerable. Others point to the possibility of a natural earthquake in the region, an event that, whether by coincidence or divine design, served as God's instrument of judgment. But regardless of scientific explanations, one truth remains. The fall of Jericho was a historic and spiritual milestone that made one thing clear: no human force can stand against the will of God. Now imagine the scene. The people of the city, confident in their fortress, suddenly see their walls collapse before their eyes. What once seemed unshakable falls in a matter of minutes. Panic sets in. Jericho's fate was sealed. But there is still a hidden truth that must be revealed. Within the walls of Jericho, there existed a society drowning in moral corruption and extreme immorality. In the next chapter, you will uncover shocking accounts of sexual practices inside the city, rituals and behaviors that reflect a people completely estranged from God. What happened there is something many avoid speaking about, but it needs to be told. Jericho was not just a city fortified with towering stone walls. Behind those walls was another invisible fortress, the culture of immorality that shaped daily life. For many, Jericho was a prosperous commercial hub and a strategic point on the map of antiquity. But for those who knew its customs, it represented a dark portrait of the moral decay of its time. Among the many disturbing aspects of its society, one of the most striking was how women were treated. Were they respected, or merely used to satisfy carnal desires and perform pagan rituals? Contrary to what many might assume, some women in Jericho did hold power and influence, particularly those connected to the nobility or commerce. However, for most common women, the reality was far different. Many were treated like commodities, traded in arranged marriages, or forced to participate in religious rituals dedicated to pagan gods. Female beauty was often exploited for political and spiritual purposes, and most of these women had no control over their own lives. But there was something even more disturbing hidden behind the city's walls: the practice of sacred prostitution. In temples dedicated to deities like Baal and Ashtoreth, rituals were conducted in which women were forced to have sexual relations with priests or foreigners, all in the name of supposed divine blessings. It was believed that the fertility of the land depended on human fertility, and these acts were not seen as sin, but as ways to please the gods, ensuring good harvests, protection, and prosperity. But God saw it all. In Leviticus 18:24-25, it is written, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." Jericho believed its customs would bring prosperity, but in reality, they were sealing its ruin. In the midst of so much decay, there was a woman named Rahab. She was not a noblewoman, not a priestess, nor did she hold any position of prestige. She was known as a prostitute, and her house was strategically built upon the city walls, a place frequented by travelers and merchants. She had certainly heard many stories about the God of Israel. And she sensed something extraordinary was coming. When the spies sent by Joshua arrived in the city, it was Rahab who hid them and helped them escape. But why? Because unlike the rest of Jericho's inhabitants, Rahab believed in the true God. She recognized that the city's walls would not be enough to stop divine judgment and pleaded for mercy. Her faith was rewarded. Her life and the lives of her family were spared. On the day of destruction, Rahab's story teaches us something profound. Even in the midst of corruption, prostitution, and idolatry, God is still searching for those who turn their hearts to Him. Many ask, was Jericho really that different from other ancient cities? The truth is, many ancient civilizations practiced immoral acts. Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, were destroyed for their depravity and rejection of divine principles. Babylon became infamous for its lust and idolatry. But Jericho carried symbolic weight. It was the first city Israel faced upon entering the Promised Land. Its fall was not just a military victory, it was a sign. God was declaring that wherever His people set foot, wickedness cannot remain. Now think about today's world. Doesn't it seem similar? We live in a society where everything is permitted, where drifting from God's values is seen as progress. But slowly, are we not rebuilding new walls of sin? Walls that one day will fall before the Lord? In the next chapter, we reach the most astonishing part, how a city considered invincible was destroyed in a single moment. What happened was more than conquest. It was a warning for all future generations. Imagine the tension inside Jericho. Its people trusted their massive walls, structures that seemed unbreakable. They felt safe. Outside, the army of Israel, led by Joshua, surrounded the city. But unlike expected, there were no battering rams, no catapults, no arrows. They marched in silence. For 6 days, the people of God walked around the city, followed by priests blowing trumpets. To the soldiers and citizens of Jericho, it must have seemed insane. And then, on the 7th day, something extraordinary happened. Joshua 6:15-16. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only, they marched around the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At that exact moment, as the people shouted a mighty cry of faith, the walls of Jericho collapsed. A city that had seemed indestructible fell, without a single sword striking its defenses. This is one of the most intriguing events in ancient history. Many theories have tried to explain what happened. Earthquake. Some scholars suggest that an earthquake might have brought down the walls. After all, the Jordan Valley lies on a seismic fault. But was it just a coincidence that the quake occurred at the precise moment of the Israelites' shout? Psychological strategy. Others believe the silent march caused psychological terror among Jericho's defenders, weakening their morale. But this theory doesn't fully explain the physical collapse of the walls. Divine intervention. For those who believe, there is no doubt, it was God who brought those walls down. His power was manifested in a clear and undeniable way. Jericho fell not by human strength, but by obedience and faith. The method used in Jericho's fall was unprecedented. A silent march, the sound of trumpets, and finally, a mighty shout. There is no known parallel to this in ancient military strategy. And more than that, the destruction was so complete that Jericho never regained the same power. If this moment moved you, show your faith with a like and share in the comments what impacted you most about Jericho's story. The fall of Jericho was not just a military triumph, it was a sign, a clear warning to all the nations of Canaan. The God of Israel was fulfilling His promise, giving the land to His people. When neighboring kings heard of Jericho's destruction, they trembled in fear. They realized they were not facing an ordinary army, but a people protected and led by the Almighty God. This event also marked a decisive moment for Israel. It was their first great victory since leaving Egypt. Just as God had opened the Red Sea to free them from slavery, now He brought down walls to prove that nothing can stop His plans. And I ask you, how many walls still stand in your life? Walls of fear, doubt, sin, or situations that seem impossible to overcome? The story of Jericho teaches us a powerful lesson. When God gives the command, even the mightiest strongholds collapse. Thank you for following this journey. May God bless your life, and I'll see you soon.